All right, folks, listen, you don't have to be a movie buff to appreciate this segment, but the Many Saints of Newark, you know, the Sopranos movie, there are two people who look at it from a historical perspective, all the way from Rutgers University in Newark. We're joined by Mary Rizzo, Associate Professor of History, and Whitney Strub, Associate Professor in the History Department at Rutgers Newark. Hey, listen, I don't want to make this about a movie review. It doesn't matter whether I like the movie or not. What matters from a historical perspective is there's so much of that movie, not just about the mob at the time of the 60s in Newark, but the relationship between the African-American community and organized crime, La Cosa Nostra, led by Italian-Americans, Italian-American mob. What is so wrong, Mary, historically and inaccurate about this film?
Well, you know, I think that it's even sort of less about whether the film is accurate or inaccurate, but what stories the film decides are important enough to tell. And so in trying to bring race relations or the topic of race relations in the 1960s and 1970s in Newark into this story about the white mafia, which is essentially what the movie is about, the film really doesn't have much to say that's really of interest, right? So that, you know, sort of racial conflict between the white mobsters and the black rising sort of criminal syndicate is just sort of depicted as this conflict between these individuals, right? That's just sort of about prejudice. When really, of course, when we look back at the history of that moment, this is a moment where Italian Americans and Black New Yorkers were battling over control of the city politically, culturally, and all of these ways. And the film really ignores that sort of larger, much more interesting, frankly, issue that was happening.
And by the way, as a young child growing up in the city in the early 70s, I will tell you, and lived through the rebellion/riots of 1967. As a little kid, and I got to tell you something. It was the strife, the tension, the confusion, all of it, so fascinating, so interesting, so scary. But none of it was in there. Whitney, jump in here. What is the message? And by the way, I'm not here to advocate any other movie or whatever, but I happen to be watching, I was telling Frank Brown, our audio engineer, I've been watching The Godfather of Harlem, which happens to be, I wish both of you could see it, because to me, the depth of it, the relationship, so complex. There's a question here, Whitney. What do we need to understand about the complexity of that relationship between African Americans and whites, disproportionately ethnic whites in our cities, and Newark being one of the biggest?
Yeah, sure. I mean, to my mind, it begins with the question of what can we really expect from a narrative Hollywood film, right? I mean, it's not a scholarly history treatise with footnotes. And it's not a documentary like Mary Lou Bongiorno's Revolution 67, right? Which has the luxury to approach this with a lot of nuance. But that being said, for me, you know, watching this film, I couldn't help but think of recent Hollywood movies that do engage with history in a more robust way, right? Whether it's Ava DuVernay's Selma, Spike Lee's *Da 5 Bloods, Judas and the Black Messiah, even somebody like Quentin Tarantino, whose films can be problematic, but profoundly engaged with history, right? And watching The Many Saints of Newark, I'm basically left feeling like it was more in the tradition of a costume drama, more in the tradition of, you know, Jerry Bruckheimer's Pearl Harbor or Forrest Gump, where history is just a series of set pieces, right? And ultimately, I think the political narrative that the film gives us is this individualized story, right? We get the Italian-American mafiosos and then one Black character, basically, Harold McBrayer, and his politics are that of sort of pull yourself up by the bootstrap, individualized, capitalist, you know, upward mobility, which I think really misses what was going on in Newark at that point, which was a flourishing of a very community-oriented radical Black politics. You know, not just Amiri Baraka, he becomes a figurehead for this, but community organizing across ethnic lines, the Black and Puerto Rican Convention, and the election.
That's right, 1970. In fact, let's move away from the movie for a second. I'm fascinated by this because not just because it was my youth in the city of Newark and Brick City, but it's Newark is so many other cities. But here's what I'm fascinated by. So organized crime, and I've often said this on the air, in my neighborhood, largely Italian-American, the mafia, organized crime, it was a part of the community. It just was, it always was. And what was fascinating to me, and I want you to comment on this in terms of 1970, what was so interesting is that in our neighborhood where we grew up, Italian American, when there was a race between Ken Gibson, a civil engineer who was running for mayor of Newark, against an indicted Italian American, mob connected, his name is Hugh Adenizio, he was in the pocket of the mob and went to jail for it, right? Disproportionately, the Italian Americans in our neighborhood were saying, at least we're going to vote for Hugh Adenizio. Yeah, he's a crook, but he's one of ours. Mary, do I have that wrong?
No, I mean, you're absolutely right. And it's that sort of ethnic sort of communal identity that allowed Italian Americans, frankly, to become the political leaders of Newark. So when Italians began to emigrate to Newark and the rest of the United States in the early 1900s, they were in very small numbers. But as those numbers grew, they realized that there were a couple of sources of power, right? One was through the underground economy, right? Through the mafia. And another, of course, was through politics, often also as well as the police. So, they brought those together and had these tight ethnic, as you well know, ethnic neighborhoods, ethnic associations, communal groups that were sources of power, but only within for that homogenous group.
That's right. And by the way, the police department at the time, led by Dominic Spina, also connected to the mob, they were corrupt as well. And the African-American community suffered disproportionately, Whitney, under that leadership. Fair? And by the way, Ken Gibson, the first African-American mayor on the Eastern Seaboard, elected in 1970. Please, Whitney.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we see some of that in the Many Saints of Newark, right? We see John Smith.
Forget about the movie, but what do we need to know about it? I'm past the movie. What is, because disproportionately the Italian Americans in our neighborhood also moved to the suburbs after that. My family did not. My family stayed. They're still part of the city, if you will. But disproportionately, once Ken Gibson became mayor, the first Black mayor in the Eastern Seaboard city, they left. My people left. That happened across this country. Did it not happen that way, Whitney?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that white backlash politics tied into a white flight that, extracted material resources from cities happened at the exact moment that Black power politics were on the rise. And so that's one of the bitter ironies of Newark history and US urban history more broadly, right? That as soon as Black political power actually asserts itself, the bottom drops out, the tax base disintegrates, and then federal policy shifts away from the 1960s Great Society programs that funded cities. And basically, a mayor like Ken Gibson is left holding a pretty empty bag.
So let me ask you this. Fast forward from 1970 to 2020, election 2021, 22, beyond. When you see the Trump dynamics, right, and those who support Donald Trump, and I'm not going to generalize here, but a significant percentage of those people who I grew up with and their parents who we grew up in the same neighborhood, they're big Trump supporters. Can you connect that back to what we're talking about right now, Mary? Or Absolutely. Is that just my interpretation of things?
No, absolutely. And, first off, I'll speak personally, right, because I'm Italian American as well. And I absolutely see the same dynamic in my family, right, where there are many of my relatives who are big Trump supporters. And I think part of that is about this mythology that Italian Americans and other white ethnic groups have really taken to be truth, which is that our families pulled ourselves up by our bootstraps, did everything on our own. And it's because we had these tight-knit communities and we wored hard that we were able to move to the suburbs.
Of course. True, Mary.
Absolutely. I'm not saying it's not. But at the same time, what we know, as well as as historians, what we know is that there were policies in place that supported white Americans as opposed to Black Americans. So that move to the suburbs, of course, was supported by huge federal investment in giving people cheap mortgages that were basically closed to Black people.
Communities where banks would not give loans or mortgages to people who were African American to make sure the community stayed white.
Absolutely. That history, I think, is becoming more well known, but it's really butting up against that mythology that we've all been taught to believe, which is that, our families, white Americans, have gotten where we are just solely from our hard work. And then therefore, if you believe that mythology, then when you see other people struggling, then it must be their fault.
And there's a lot of resentment there. There's a lot of misplaced resentment. Go ahead, Whitney, I'll give you the last word there. I know I'm oversimplifying amplifying this and personalizing it, and because I just see so much of it around me right now. Go ahead.
No, if you want to see the origins of Trumpism in Newark, I mean, just look to Anthony.
How about Anthony Imperiale? Was he? Exactly. It was Anthony Imperiale who happened to be, go back and read, my father's nemesis at the time in the neighborhood. He was an avowed white supremacist, racist. That, to me, was the beginning of a lot of what we're seeing today.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at quotes from Imperiale in the late 1960s, it sounds exactly like Donald Trump in 2016 or 2020. It's a sense of white grievance politics, framing people of color as a frightening other who's undeserving, and vigilante politics as well, carrying weapons around with this false sense of fear. Yeah, and all of that, is something I think that makes a richer narrative than a gangster melodrama in this Many Saints of Newark.
Hey, Whitney, Mary, I want to apologize for getting on my soapbox. It's too close to home for me.
No, it's great.
It's way too close to home. I want to thank both of you for joining us. We'll have you back to talk more about history from a whole range of perspectives. And we appreciate you and all of our friends from Rutgers Newark. All the best.
Thank you so much.
I'm Steve Adubato. That's the best we have at Rutgers Newark. We're good. See you next time.
State of Affairs with Steve Adubato is a production of the Caucus Educational Corporation. Funding has been provided by Atlantic Health System, the Russell Berry Foundation, the Turrell Fund, supporting Reimagine Childcare, PNC, Grow Up Great, Community Food Bank of New Jersey, Johnson & Johnson, Summit Health, the Fidelco Group, and by the North Ward Center. Promotional support provided by AM 970 The Answer and by CIANJ and Commerce Magazine.
How do you create change? By cultivating hope. And we see that every day. In the eyes of our preschoolers, in the souls of the seniors in our Adult Day program, in the minds of the students at Robert Treat Academy, a national Blue Ribbon School of Excellence, in the passion of children in our Youth Leadership Development Program, in our commitment to connections at the Center for Autism, and in the heart of our community, the North Ward Center, creating opportunities for equity, education, and growth.